Hello, everybody. My name is Philip Nicholas. I'm joined here today by Lew, who has recently partaken in my course, What is Philosophy, on the Halkyon Thinkers Guild or the Halkyon Academy. And so the course was largely about Collingwood and his thoughts about what is philosophy, what is philosophical methodology, what is philosophical concepts, how does it all differ from natural science, social science, and so on. So basically, getting down to the meat and potatoes, a little bit about the details of just what philosophy is. And I thought it'd be good to have a discussion here with Lew, who is something of an independent scholar. He is a living, walking library. His exuberance and interests seems to just stretch everywhere, from British idealists to cybernetics to Heidegger and all over the place. So he's a rich and interesting and wonderful person, and I'm glad to have him with me here today. And yeah, we'll just talk a bit about Collingwood and a tradition he formed part of, and whatever else Sophia takes us. So yeah, welcome, Lew. Glad to have you here.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Philip. And that was not the staid, modest introduction we discussed beforehand. So
Well,
I'll remember that. But thank you for those kind words. Yeah. So you chose. I think it would be interesting to maybe go a little bit more. I know you mentioned it was just you discovered Collingwood through a course, but maybe you can talk a little about why you found his book, An Essay on Philosophical Method, appropriate for people who might be brand new to philosophy, or people who just might be curious in how one begins philosophy.
Yeah. Well, I think Collingwood's, in contrast to a lot of philosophers, especially like people who are like well known and big, like Heidegger, Kant, Hegel, and so on, is very straightforward in his writing, and he does a good job of leading the reader, making it as accessible, as user friendly as he can, but also at the same time getting to the points that he wants to make. But what really is interesting, I think, for me and maybe for others, is just his idea of a scale of forms. How he manages to sort of take this huge tradition of philosophers, going back to Aristotle, Aquinas, and so on, Spinoza, and pick out an idea or a concept that sort of runs through all of them. And this is Collingwood's own sort of original contribution, I think, is to see like, well, how does philosophical thinking, philosophical concepts differ from other kinds of systems and of knowledge and so on, bodies of knowledge that we have. And he comes up with this idea of a philosophical scale of forms, that philosophical ideas kind of have this overlapping structure to them, and that there is at no stage in the concept of, or the knowledge of those things, where we are at zero. Right, so we come into it knowing we've already been in it in some sense, in some minimal sense. So we and then we go take things from there, right? We develop further.
Absolutely. I mean, that chapter especially, it's called The Scale of Forms. I felt like, when you read a talented philosopher, you often find that they're saying things that are to some extent familiar to you, like things you might have already thought or come across, but with so much more clarity and distinctness, use the Cartesian phrase, and in a much more worked out, systematic fashion. Of course, system was the last class that we ended on, Collingwood's discussion of system. But especially in that chapter, Scale of Forms, I just found that he was able to put into these ideas, specifically the overlapping nature of philosophical concepts, without making it like too easy, like to just say that, oh, philosophical concepts aren't amenable to neat distinctions and definition in the same way that, say, scientific concepts are. You could just say that, but to spell it out in a conceptual manner is another thing entirely.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's very interesting, because I mean, that is usually how people start, I feel like, begin discussing a philosophical topic. It's like, okay, let's have our definitions and what is clearly distinct from what. And something that I got from Collingwood is, if we're really discussing philosophical concepts of philosophical content, this method of just like neat definition of like making sure you have everything laid out and this is not that, this is not that. That is very rudimentary and really only gets you so far, and actually might not pertain to specifically philosophical content of concepts.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely right. So there is still classification going on in philosophy.
Yes.
Thinking, right? We are very, happy about categories and making distinctions and making labels and so on, right? But as then you said, right, there is this overlap also going on between the terms, between ignorance and knowledge, right? Ugliness and beauty, right? There is a sense in which these terms are connected, not just polar opposites of each other.
Mhm.
Or if they just are polar opposites of each other, then there is an opposition, but an opposition suggests that they are connected somehow. What is that connection, right?
Mhm.
And as philosophers, we want to, open that up and examine it and understand, well, why is, there's such thing as beauty and ugliness and the good and the true, and how does truth, relate to error and ignorance and so on. But the overlap that Collingwood talks about, as you point out, needs to be understood really carefully, right? Because it's not just, oh, you have term A and then B, and then you think of it as like them circles, and they at some point touch, and there is a overlap there, right? The overlap is much more, I think, special. I want to say nuanced, but that doesn't really get at the heart of the matter. It's a kind of conceptual overlap, not a spatial or temporal or what have you kind of overlap. And that the nature of this overlap in philosophical methods and thinking is such that it's not about collapsing differences,
Mhm.
right? The distinctions we pick out in whatever we're looking at, right? It's not like the overlap reduces them to just collapses them into identity, but
Mhm.
recognizes that the differences form part of a, maybe let's say, higher difference or a more integrated difference.
Mhm.
And that, well, whatever it is we're discussing, whether it's, let's say friendship, right? It becomes better embodied in these more these forms which can integrate the differences of the lower kinds, right? And so it kind of forms a hierarchy, right? But
Mhm.
that means that the differences are not sort of put on a flat or an indifferent scale, right? There is a sense in
Yes.
which there is something that's worse and there is something that's better,
Yes.
and we want to know why that is, not just because there's a new kind, right? No, because this higher kind relates to the other kinds, right, in a way in which that it takes on board their difference, but it
Mhm.
also cancels out their deficiencies, right? So in the case of is a friendship, right, the good friend can also be useful, but is
Mhm.
not limited to just being useful, right?
Mhm.
takes on a broader scope, more richness, and so on. Same thing with, I think, with truth, right? It sort of integrates the error, right? What went wrong there, and so on, without purely restricting itself to just the state of error.
Yes, and the even any neat opposition you could draw between, say, error and the correct, you'll have to say more, and it's a great way to show that there's a richness to philosophical thinking that is not captured, to use a word you mentioned earlier, of like classificate, a mere classification, or like, I think like a word they use in maybe more analytic circles, like descriptivist kind of discussions of language. And yeah, spelling out, I mean, he gets into the details, so we won't maybe spell out exactly like scale of forms in every respect, but I found it to be, on the one hand, it's like recapitulating, I feel like, things that you can maybe find in other philosophers. Plato has a scale.
Yeah.
Hegel talks about, change and how to think about change. But that chapter in Collingwood sets it out just basically as like, hey, we're going to be thinking about virtually anything. And this is the kind of, I don't want to say framework, because that sounds almost like too static. Framework almost has a taxonomic quality to it, as if we could just have everything in place finally.
Yeah. Makes it sound like an app, just as something you apply.
Yeah, exactly. And there's something living to that overlap in philosophical concepts that, I think about Fichte. Yes, he writes the Wissenschaftslehre, his main book. He writes it over and over every year for like, I don't know, like 12 years or something. And I see that as something like, you can't crystallize philosophical thinking into a formula. It has to kind of be arrived at each time anew.
Yeah.
But that also doesn't mean that it's ephemeral and it is just in the moment and disappears with the moment. So it's tough to exactly characterize what it is. Obviously, that's why we need an essay on philosophical method. But I found that. Go ahead.
Oh, no, please go on.
But I mean, I was, because I knew of Collingwood before I took your course, but I had never really read him. The only time I had seen him referred to is like people talk about philosophy of history, which is not really. I mean, we can get into this later. It's not really something that, at least, many big name Anglo, British or American philosophers have taken up philosophy of history and philosophy of art. And once I was in the course, I looked at him, and his father was like an art historian, and and Collingwood is part of this larger tradition that we'll talk about called British idealism. But I was not aware that, honestly, that he had such a robust philosophical mind for topics apart from like art and philosophy of history. What might be viewed in some quarters as like soft subjects or something, but like he goes directly into like questions of like logic, philosophical methodology, how to think about metaphysics, how to think about systems, all of these things. That was a pleasant surprise.
Yeah, no, he's a serious philosopher. He isn't just well, I'm not saying this as in any sense, like just a historian or just a art theorist or what have you, right? Those are, if you're just doing history, then you're still doing something worthwhile and so on.
Yeah.
But like Collingwood was just like all over the place. He was a bit of a eclectic in the sense of like he was doing archaeology and history, and he was doing philosophy of history, and he was doing philosophy of art, and he was doing philosophy on philosophy, right?
Yes.
And he had a passion for these things, and I think this also informs, it sort of seems reflected in his theory that things have to be formed in a philosophical scale of forms where things overlap, because it seems like how our lives are structured too, right? That things are connected in various ways, and that try as we might to formalize ourselves, put ourselves in determined professions or determined roles of society and so on, ultimately these are just stepping stones or various different moments of our lives, not our lives entirely.
Absolutely. And it harkens to a time when perhaps you could still be that kind of eclectic. Although from what I've seen, it seems like Collingwood is pretty much at the end of that. But you know, if you think of, say, there's maybe 120 years from like Kant's flourishing as a professor to, say, when Collingwood is working. And, you know, Kant would lecture on like natural science, on like astronomy, on anthropology. Like it was like,
Yeah.
Dude, you don't have a PhD in these subjects. What gives you the, you know, the right to lecture on these things? But that was never a question in those days. It was, you know, kind of, you were an academic,
Yeah.
from what I understand, and you basically had the right to lecture on whatever you wanted almost. Of course, there are some guidelines, but much less strict than you do now. And even in Collingwood's time, I would say it was less strict perhaps than things are now. But nevertheless, you can see just from his interests and what he was able to do, that there was that opportunity to look at so many different disciplines. And honestly, I'm so excited now to want to have the time to go back and look at his books on, say, art, or on the philosophy of history, or so he has an essay on metaphysics, which is like talking a lot about Aristotle, which is amazing. I'm like so excited to look back at things, because now I feel like I will take them more seriously. Not that I wouldn't have before, but it's like, wow, here is an accomplished thinker of philosophical methodology turning to the specific content of, say, art, or history or archaeology, for God's sake. I don't know many philosophers who are also archaeologists.
It does give a certain sort of grounding and training, right? When somebody goes into the depths of philosophical methodology and metaphysics, and then turns to something like art or religion or what have you, right? They come into it with this robust, sensitive, rich, exact, you know, methodology that they've developed from the purely philosophical sphere. It's kind of what Hegel did too, right? He worked hard at, you know, truth, what is truth, and then the methodology and the metaphysics and so on, right? And then he turned to art. And what happened was this, you know, 1,200 pages of him just going at it at the history of art, right?
Yeah, I mean, a friend of mine, Simon, has pointed out to me that Hegel was part of, I think, the Jena, one of the German mineralogical society. So it's like a society that talks about different minerals and, you know, mining and things like that. And it's like, well, what is a philosopher doing there? And
yes,
he from what I understand, he pretty much had a very comprehensive grasp of science as it was on the cutting edge in his time. And I think Heidegger has a remark somewhere that Hegel was the last, not only the last in terms of his personal ability to do that, but also the last time it was perhaps feasible for an individual to learn, just because, I guess, as the sciences grow more and more in their specializations, it becomes just perhaps, you know, for a mortal life, impossible to truly expertly have expert knowledge, you know, in physics, in mineralogy, in, you know, engineering, and mathematics, and philosophy. You know, it's just that's why I think nowadays we have such kind of tight regulation, maybe, of the departments.
Yeah. Well, this is one of the things that I think Collingwood discusses in this chapter on system, right?
Right.
Well, how can there be a philosophical system now when there is just so much knowledge around?
Yeah.
There's so much, you know, nuanced, in-depth, specialized knowledge that requires specialized training, and not everybody can get that specialized training. So, you know, why even try? Why even bother? And his answer to that is, I think, that Well, it's not like philosophers built things from scratch in the first place. They relied
Mhm,
on other people. They relied on other philosophers, right?
mhm.
Most of the time, they just contribute their own thing to whatever it is, but they wouldn't have gotten there to that stage without that prior development, without those other people, figuring stuff out and so on. So if you look at it in those terms, then really, you know, um, Collingwood to Kant or Collingwood to now, the principle hasn't really differed that much. Yes, there
Yeah,
is more specialization, but that just means you have to rely on more people, which
yeah,
has to be a good thing, right? Because then there are more minds at work in this overall project, and you sit with better information and grounding than anyone else has had ever before. So
yes.
in a way, it's like you can now really make the system, great again.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So it's
Um,
not a weakness. It's a strength, really.
yes, and that was an optimistic note for me because I've definitely perhaps not thinking it was a strength, until I had read Collingwood and gave me pause to think about it. But I would say that perhaps that this tradition that he's sort of being a capstone of British idealism was, we could talk about idealism in general, was an attempt to give some impression of the whole, was to
Mhm.
try to think about how all of these things interact. I mean, we, you go as a student, you join university, and all of the different majors are just given. And how are you told to decide? Either your parents are like, you got to be a doctor, or we're not paying for your university. So that's how you decide. Or you're like, hey, I enjoy solving mathematical problems, so maybe I'll be a math major. Or hey, I really enjoy hands-on stuff, so I'm going to major in agricultural science. Or you just go from like whatever personal inclination is in you, and that's how
Yeah.
you make your decision. But this isn't very practical. But what if we were to say, like, well, let's look at all of the disciplines together. How do they all interact? Why are they organized this way? And do they have to be organized this way? Is there any necessity to the structure of the different disciplines of knowledge and expertise? And could we actually try and make an objective decision as to what is most important to study? That might sound very far-fetched because I think we're so used to just it's either subjectivity or your family that decides it. But um, you need kind of a vision of how does the whole, it's called a university,
Yeah.
same word as the universe, because it's one split in many. So what is the principle that one behind all of these different, subjects that, gives them coherence, give it, say, it's not just as Kant says often, it's not just a random groping about. It's not just an aggregated heap with no structure to it. We think there's some structure. Now, I would say that the philosophers that came in to sort of elbow out Collingwood's tradition of British idealism, the early, say, like Moore and Russell, and
Yeah.
uh, I would say that they were very hesitant about anybody talking about the whole and this grand, any kind of grand system that's going to unite all the different things. Now, not to say that they weren't very learned in their own capacity, but I think they regarded with skepticism, and I think that skepticism has transferred perhaps to the broader, maybe Anglo-American intellectual culture of
Mhm.
anybody who's trying to learn everything is probably just going to sound like a crazy person, or just it's impossible. And so you better specialize. And then we have kind of a sort of unstated heuristics as like, okay, the most rigorous is physics, so our
Yeah.
physicists are our most esteemed intellectuals, or the most rigorous is mathematics, or whatever it might be. So I do think that Collingwood and his tradition are important sort of countervailing urge to say we do need to think the whole, like, and that perhaps is where we can find some coherence.
Mhm. Yeah, because I think that somebody's taking care of the whole anyway, right? So we can either be sort of leave us to, whoever's in charge, or we can try to figure out, well, what is actually the whole? What is the principle? What's going on here, right? Because I think somebody's managing the whole already, and seems to me in modern universities nowadays, it's like the business department. They're managing the university. It's commercialized, it's about producing bachelor students, master students, PhD students, and sort of, uh, earning, price with regards to the product and so on, right?
Yeah,
And,
students are income, faculty are costs. We need to
yes,
increase the former and reduce the latter.
exactly. And they have done that, right? They have the ratio of teachers is almost barely moved, whereas the ratio of students had just exploded.
Wow.
So they have been doing that consistently. And from a business perspective, that makes perfect sense, right?
Yeah.
This if you're running it like a business, then this is what you should be doing.
That's right.
The question then is, do we want our universities run as businesses? Because businesses have certain ideas of what they want to achieve, and maybe that's not what we want to achieve when we go into a university, or the university itself, as the activity of all the people going on in there, what they want to achieve. Do they just want to achieve the goals of the business, or do they want to achieve, self-cultivation, becoming more human, or becoming more ethical, moral, more knowledgeable, what have you, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting why the business mindset wasn't always active in the university, because now it seems like so evident. I would say, at least, an American, like, of course you should run it like a business. That's what's going to make it efficient. That's what's going to make it run properly. So to me, there isn't even another voice almost in the of like, well, what other sort of this is a painful phrase, but on what other sort of system of values would you run an institution? And it's interesting to think that that actually is a historical phenomenon. Like, it wasn't always run like this. And in fact, the universities were started, as religious institutions, in the West at least. And they certainly had a different articulation, through the centuries, but to some degree they are a medieval, institution. And I don't think that the medievals had that mindset of like, this is why we're going to start this university, to make money,
Right. So this reminds me of a distinction that Collingwood himself draws in an essay of philosophical method. He speaks about the right and expediency.
Yes.
Right. So expediency, just doing things for the sake of being expedient, seems to violate doing things that are right, doing things that are just, right? Because if you're just doing things for the sake of utility, being bureaucratic, what have you, then from the point of view of something that's right, it seems like a violation, like a detriment. However, once you do the right thing, once you do the just thing, can you not also include the expedient thing, right? Why does it need to be either or? Why can't the right and the good stuff, include being expedient, include being efficient, right? And I think his idea is basically right about that, right? And I think that has to be the case, because you don't, as people want to say, like, you don't get a free lunch, right?
Yeah.
And a university just doesn't pop out of the blue. It is an organization. people
Yes.
do need to pay their bills. They need to be fed and so on, right? But I guess it becomes a question of priority and
Mhm.
what is to be emphasized here. So I think, in medieval times, they had to worry about the same stuff, right? The
Yeah.
food and security and so on. But that wasn't the end all for their organization, because the organization was geared around this activity, namely the cultivation of in those times, I guess, the theological and religious mind, but that included philosophy and law and other things.
That's right. It's like philosophy's kind of place among the disciplines has perhaps changed. I think at some point in the Middle Ages, it was like philosophy is the handmaiden of theology.
Yeah.
And then in Kant's time, philosophy or metaphysics specifically is the queen of the sciences. So it got promoted at some point.
Yeah, but it got promoted, but already that promotion kind of rings a false bell because it's already dethroned.
Yeah,
Sciences were marching full speed ahead at that time.
that's right. Yeah. He's already speaking of a bygone age.
Yeah. But this is like something that I think concerns for the whole already have stand at a weaker position,
Okay.
because the reality usually tends to favor things that are good at exploiting it.
Yeah.
Right? So if you're a mathematician or a formal logician and you develop, something like Boolean system, and then which can be used to manipulate digital systems and then build computers and so on,
Yeah.
you're way more valuable to reality than somebody who ponders the whole and how it all hangs together. So
Absolutely.
it's just that we are in a shitty position, the people who have interest in the whole, because the whole is not what is immediately most important. But it becomes more important, I think, as we all grow and develop, because I think if we restrict ourselves to particular things, particular concerns, then there's going to be a mismatch between what I think is our ultimate concern and these more restricted concerns.
Yes.
That mismatch is going to come out in stuff like trauma and depression and what have you.
Yes, much to say about, and it's interesting because I think you're exactly right that it's not as if, okay, we need to get a huge fund going for people contemplating the whole and like somehow make that economically viable so we can maximize the number of people contemplating the whole. That would be great, but like I don't think we have delusions that will happen, and so you need to ask like, I would my hunch would be that there is something essential about, let's say, that the humanities, or there's no really good word for a non-specialized philosophy and its subdisciplines or whatever you may have you, but let's just say the humanities were shorthand.
Mm-hmm.
There's something essentially disadvantageous about it in this realm that we're speaking of, where it will always fall prey to like the more expedient, the more applicable, the more practical, the more immediately, like there's something essential to that happening. So we shouldn't be surprised and we shouldn't get angry and try to like change the humanities to be like, actually, it's a great business major,
Yeah.
There's something essential to it.
Yeah.
And borrowing a phrase from something I read recently, but we can question whether it's right to judge the useless. We might think that contemplating the whole is immediately useless, if we agree on that. Judging that the useless by the standard of the useful. So why should it be the case that we kind of we're almost judging the whole by one of its parts, saying
Mhm.
like,
Yeah.
this doesn't fit the expediency standard, so therefore we're throwing it out. Well, then your whole will soon become entirely about expediency.
Yeah, and that just becomes the new whole, and then it becomes like, okay, well, is this really the experience of the whole we have? Is this, does this this new whole uh, sort of fill a hole, in us, right, so to speak?
Absolutely, and I think that once expediency becomes the guiding principle, it's, of course, you're going to see things like people are, there was one philosophy department was like, we need to save costs. We need you to join with another department. You're going to join with one department, and then the philosophers were like, the philosophy faculty was like, well, what department? They're like, we don't care. Art history, German language, religious studies, just join with any one of them. It'll be expedient. It's like, well, there isn't much of a thoughtful, principle to this. It's just purely cost saving. But if that is your guiding principle, then honestly, that's a rational decision. I would support that given that guiding principle. But to step back, you can think about how could you step back and ask if that's the guiding principle. The response will immediately be, well, it's a question of necessity. We won't survive if we can't compete, if we don't maximize, if we don't optimize all our resources, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, it seems to end the conversation. There could be no kind of more thinking there, because like, okay, it's a matter of necessity. We do this or we don't survive. But that sort of presented necessity, I think, comes on this assumption that like basically the useless is just extra that has to be cut away, and the useless being judged by the standard of the useful will always result in us cutting away, things that aren't immediately practical.
But like, our society has been wonderful at producing uselessness out of the useful. Seems to me like the real anthropological history shows that what we're engaged in doing is constantly to create as much leisure time as we can, right? To do as least amount of work as we can, to then do what we want to do, which is to philosophize about what we're doing in the first place and why we're doing anything, right? What we're all for, and so on. But that requires a point at which the activity of use generates some surplus, right? Where we make more food than we need at the immediate moment, which allows us then to, relax or what have you, right? So the useful stuff seems to come first in the order of history and so on. But I think society has just more and more become geared towards building or creating more spaces of uselessness, right? Because we simply don't need to care about stuff like food, security, shelter, and so on. These are now more and more taken care of, and yet we're still obsessed about the useful. Still obsessed about there has to be this sense of that we need to produce something, be producing something worthwhile, and that it has to address the reality of the market or what have you, right?
And I think it was in the idleness course that Johannes did for the Halkyon forum. Otium cum dignitate, the course on idleness. We read an essay by Bertrand Russell in praise of idleness. And then I think by way of being a contemporary, we mentioned John Maynard Keynes, who somewhere says that, this is in like the early 20th century, says that we just have to tolerate he said it in a kind of like Christian way, although it was just metaphorical, I think. He's like, we just have to tolerate the sin of like usury for 100 years, and then we will have produced so much extra stuff that everybody can live like a totally leisurely life.
Yeah.
It's like we just have to sacrifice this 1 century of economic, absolute economic priority, and then that will pay off dividends for like the rest of human civilization.
Right.
And to your point, I think there is something to that. Like, I would wager that I probably have had more leisure time than previous generations. But there's also something where it feels like we're almost less capable of enjoying that leisure, or of seeing its rightful place. It's almost like leisure has become just the regeneration phase for more work. It doesn't have an end in itself, which in this would be another discussion, but it's like in prior ages, concepts like skole in Greek, leisure, otium in the Roman time, idleness. It was kind of recognized that like that has an important role for its own sake. And that doesn't mean that the whole society is now organized toward maximizing that in a kind of expedient way, but just there is a sort of grounding element to leisure. Again, it's not a great word, but Aristotle says that like if you're going to do philosophy, you're going to need leisure time. He already says that.
Sure. Yeah. I think people intuitively have already a sense of leisure and making a space for other stuff than work, because most people are just geared towards a good life, right? And they have it within themselves to kind of intuitive sense of like, well, life isn't just about this one thing, because I am already have various different interests and concerns. I cannot put myself in this single box. I need to put myself in lots of different boxes. And maybe there'll be more boxes, maybe less, but it's going to have to be a multitude of different things, and I have to sort of spread myself across all these different domains, or else I will suffer, right? And I think most people have this sort of general impulse that they want to go beyond themselves, transcend themselves, to go on adventures, as people want to say. So it's just that it's not something that's very much reflected in, I guess, big discourse. Big discourse seems to be targeting the failures of capitalism and shortcomings and so on of that, but not about the good life that already is at work, right? And must be at work, otherwise people would just stop, right? They would stop being people. I don't think that's the case.
Yeah, or at least in the world I grew up in, the sort of solution to this issue of like, okay, leisure is great, so that makes it seem like work is bad. And here we have a neat classification. The sort of solution to that issue is like, well, then find something that you love, and then you'll never work a day in your life.
Yeah.
And like that it's almost just like avoiding the problem of like, okay, we can totally unite, have a total overlap of leisure and work if you're just doing something you're passionate about.
Right.
And of course, certainly you want to be doing something that you're passionate about, but having now lived a few years older, and having met a lot of people, and myself having the time to do things I'm passionate about, even for a living, there's always times where you feel like, God, this is work. Like even if it is you wouldn't want to be doing anything else. There's no getting around the laborious aspect sometimes of any activity. And so then it becomes a question like, do I just abandon it now? Because again, leisure was, feeling good was my kind of goal. So now that I'm not feeling good pursuing my passion project, should I abandon it? And usually no, like you're not going to do that. But then it seems like you need some sort of higher principle than just mere what feels good right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and
exactly.
but it's hard to get farther than that in big discourse, because then you start talking about the good life, and that can create arguments.
Yeah, you're right about like we need to develop a more comprehensive idea of who we are, what we want to do. That includes, there's going to be some drudgery here and there, but it's not about immediate gratification, right? It's more about this holistic project that you yourself embark on, and that you see, gratification more like something that can be something weighted and developed over a course of time, not something that you just immediately get. And nor should you want to train yourself to get it in that way, right?
And I'm just making this connection in the moment, but you can see how the tendency towards total expediency would cut against that grain, because expediency is certainly to some degree like as fast as possible, getting that gratification faster and faster. And so that could, I'm not saying that means that that's the cause. Like, of course, this is a complex issue we're talking about, but you could see how that tendency to see the fastest gratification possible as the guiding principle could, attenuate your ability to resist that desire, and to think in terms of a whole that is not solely guided by immediate gratification.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I think expediency, you can also make the argument to the totally expedient person that, well, if you can go on, try to get these cheap thrills, but if you hold on and do a bit of work, you'll get better thrills, right? Your quality of enjoyment will improve. So
yes,
that's one way of also working against the expediency, is that don't put everything on the same level, on the same dimension, right?
Yes.
There are multiple dimensions.
Yes.
What Herbert Marcuse talks about in the One-Dimensional Man.
Right.
The expediency totalizing picture is a tendency to just reduce everything to the same plane. But things are not to the same plane. There are different kinds, there are different qualities and experiences and so on. And this is something, to go back to Collingwood, is what his philosophical scale of forms is also in tune with, right? That the higher form on the scale is not meant to replace the lower forms, but include them as those lower forms. So in the case of friendship, the good friendship includes the pleasurable friendship and the useful friendship and politeness and what have you, right? It doesn't pretend to take over their roles. And so it is by sort of by its very concept, or by its essence, something multidimensional. But that is something that as is harder to think about. It's more mediated, right? It's less accessible, less.
Oh, that's a brilliant. Yeah, that's a brilliant connection. And so then it becomes a question how to foster because I could see it's like it would be easy to pay lip service to this multidimensionality, but then in practice just have the single dimension of expediency, which
yes,
is what happens often.
Yeah.
And so it becomes a question of like, how does one begin to be sensitive to this, multidimensionality of a life project, and I mean, this is great. I see the many branches this conversation could go, but I immediately think of philosophy of education. It's like, what is education supposed to provide? And in my mind, one thing like a liberal education, in the sense of like making one free, libertas, is to provide some sensitivity to this whole of like what a life as a whole could look like, what potential there is in a human life.
Mhm.
And so I really think that you know, the liberal education, it's very hard to fit that into the mold of, I don't know, what's going to be most successful right away in business, or what's going to provide the best career. It's not that they can't do those things. They certainly have those, you know, you could make many pragmatic arguments for them. But this idea of kind of providing something that's immediately useless, but in immediate sense, very grounding and provides coherence for one's life's projects.
Yeah, I think
It's very hard to to mesh that with immediate practicality.
Mm. But I think one of the key things needs to be careful about is, I would say that the liberal education, to go with your example,
Okay.
isn't so much showing you what a free life could be, but making you understand that you're already in the free life, already living as a multi-dimensional being. And
Yes.
I think part of the duty of a liberal education is for you to make sure you take care of that you
Yes.
don't fall into a trap of restricting yourself into a single dimension of whether that, you know, or whether it's work or playing this specific role that your family or, you know, your community assigns to you, right? That you're already multidimensional, and
Yes.
that is how you got to this place. That is how society got to this place of having a liberal institution in the first place.
Yes.
And that's another wonderful thing with Collingwood, is that, you know, when you go through his book and you understand the concept, and go through like the scale of forms and categorical thinking and so on, you come to realize that, well, actually, I've been doing most of these things all the time, right? My thinking has already been oriented towards these things. And so,
Yeah.
as one philosophical scholar put it, like in his book, is like, philosophy is not going to teach you anything you don't already know. And I think in some sense that is absolutely right. It's not putting you in new places. It's rather showing to you the newness of the places you're already in.
Yes. No, it's a very important distinction. It's a great.
Because I share with you the ideological worries. There is so much, you know, that could deceive us and put us on the wrong way. But I think one way of combating that is just recognize that, well, actually, you know, part of where we want to go is we're already there in some sense. We just have to unpack and make ourselves sensitive to what's already around us.
I was just looking up. I always forget the name of the comédie by Molière. It's called Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme, and but in that there's a character, Monsieur Jourdain, and he's surprised to learn that he's been speaking prose all his life. You know, he's like, "What is prose?" And he's like, "Oh, you've been using it your whole life." And he's like, "Wow," and I think that captures exactly, you know, the great point you made, that that you're becoming aware of faculties that are already perhaps in use.
Yeah.
Through a liberal education, and it's important to take care of those, and to return to another point you made about how, you know, even if we do kind of as a decision-making procedure have expediency as the guiding principle, there's still the actual whole, and we see as expediency is operative in, say, an institution or one's life, it becomes more and more disjoint with like reality, or whatever word you want to use it. Like, well, actually, there's a much more multidimensional whole that you are missing, and I lost my point. Sorry.
All right. It'll come back.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. So, yeah, what is going on there when we, in some sense, like it's hard to describe because like it's not as if that multidimensionality in your person has gone away, hasn't gone out of existence. We might say it's like sitting there in potentiality, or it's laying dormant in some sense, or it's operative in a way that you're not aware of. And what happens to then the human being when it's not fully aware of the multidimensionality of it? That would be the question that I would want to think about.
Yeah. Well, I would say it suffers in some way, because.
But it's hard to immediately say, because it's like we want, the disadvantages that we could list would all sound like things that, okay, well, we can provide a nice, easy, practical solution to those. Oh, you get depressed? Then we have pharmaceuticals for that. Right. Oh, you don't feel calm? We have a meditation app that you can do every day. Oh, you don't feel great at work? Well, we'll move you to like this position.
Yeah, but that is addressing the matter as a particular issue. But what if the issue is the wholeness itself, right?
Yeah.
Then there's no particular thing that can really match that. You got to change the whole in some respect. Whether it's the whole of your life, your own life, or the whole of the community you're part of. As Aristotle I think points out, if you're in a shitty state, you're screwed.
Yeah.
To paraphrase.
Yeah. And that's I believe it's Bradley. So in the book that we read, Essay on Philosophical Method, Collingwood also has an essay on Bradley. He was like one of the most famous, or some would say notorious, British idealists. This kind of lost tradition. And I think it's Bradley has a phrase of my station and its duties, and very kind of Victorian sounding, but something like that. The point Aristotle is making, where Bradley's talking about ethics and the good life, and he wants to emphasize how much of that depends on my station and its duties, where it's not just a matter of what I want, but or what would make for me a pleasurable life as long as I don't harm anybody. There's also finding meaning in a whole, where station is just what is your position in society, and what duties does that come with, and that this all has a very I don't know, almost like paternalistic ring to it now, but I see it as, at least in part, getting to this issue of what Aristotle talks about, is like you can't just individually become, okay, say individually you read all the philosophy and you learn all things. There's still this fact that you are living with other people in a community, and that is not just another particular thing. That's part of the whole.
Indeed. And usually how fixing things in that domain is done through a lot of hard work, either through reformation in the formal systems and the laws and so on, but usually problems are down at the cultural level, racism and segregation and all that, and then you have to take into a much more drastic measures activism and so on to shift the whole. There you have this strange place where you are unable to feel at home in the whole you're in. The whole is somehow restricting you, making you deficient, and you kind of have to appeal to a higher principle than what the whole currently has, in order to make the whole come in, more in tune with that higher principle, which is so you have to kind of fall back on the kind of moralistic stance to push through and to alter the whole through particular action, in order to get to bring in more, and to make it so that the issues you have, you can be at home in that society.
Yes.
So I'm thinking, here about, Hegel and his idea of ethical life, right? Where, society is made up of this huge substance where a lot of the things are implicit. There are habits, there are customs, and so on. But what if all those things are actively, going against who you are, right? Whether it's, your sexual orientation, or, the skin on the color of your skin, and so on, right? What do you then do?
Yeah.
There is, real struggle. If this is supposed to be your substance, this is supposed to be the thing that is kind of like the soil upon which you grow as a person.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's I think Collingwood and good philosophers generally can help with this, not in the sense of like showing you how to do best activism or something like that, but thinking about what the whole is, and why it's not just why changing it isn't just like tuning an instrument or like fixing a machine. Because I'm just using the word analysis in a basic way, not to refer to like the tradition or anything like that, but just like in a very analytic mindset. It's like, okay, you break things into parts. So like, okay, we have society where we have people who don't feel at home. So if we just break it into parts, we can identify the causes of the of the bad things, and then we can change or eliminate those causes, and then the whole is great again. And I think that somebody like Collingwood and the other people of the British idealist tradition will show you that the whole isn't like that. It's not. It can't be dissected and just manipulated like that. There's something different to it.
And you can't just alter the whole in one go, right?
Yeah.
Okay, like you have a revolution, then you have the new republic, and then everything is fine. No, usually what happens, everything is way worse off precisely through that method, right? You get the terror, or you get the what happened in Russia with the Soviet revolution. On the whole, the situation got a lot worse for a lot of people there.
Yeah.
Precisely because they have this certain mindset of procedure.
And also, I think it makes for like, simplified thinking of, some aspects of like conspiratorial thinking, like, okay, just this one group or this one cabal or this one, regime, they're the cause of all these issues. And if we can just extirpate them from the context, then everything will be great.
Yeah.
And there can certainly be, negative elements of society. There can certainly be bad regimes, but again, that idea to like isolate just the issue to one part, you're missing the whole.
Exactly. Yeah. You gotta approach things from a standpoint of multi-dimensionality, right?
Yeah.
So there's a group of people you might not agree with politically, but those are people. They are fathers, they are mothers, they might be professionals, they have skills and trades and so on, and they have their own concerns and so on and so forth. So stuff just gets messy.
It is fascinating because if it's like we want change now, and you probably are right and just to demand change now if your circumstances are truly unjust, and there's a sense of like urgency, like this has to be done right now. There's no time for like sitting back and like thinking and discussing,
right?
And it's like I don't want to deny it, there's a place for that kind of urgency, but if that becomes the sole mode of like engaging in change, that would create a society where everything is an emergency.
Yes, and we know what kinds of states those things produce, right?
Yes.
A state of perpetual emergency. Yes, that's
Yes.
so yeah, one way street down to some bad ideologies, I think.
Yeah.
So maybe we should talk a little bit about the larger British idealist tradition, because we've been, I feel like, all over the place, and
Yeah.
I think this is nice a way of expressing what philosophy has taught us and how we approach things and think about things. But yeah, tell me just what your notion of the British idealists and how you see them as a historical period and what in the history of philosophy and so on.
For sure. I'm just going to grab a book right here that's relevant. It'll take 2 seconds. Okay,
Now,
so this
intermission.
so this is a book called The Age of Analysis by this guy Morton White.
Yeah.
Not really remembered. One of the but you can see that it's dedicated to G.E. Moore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think he was his teacher. Anyway, it's just a book about sort of the rise of analytic philosophy. But check out the title of the first chapter.
Ooh, the decline and fall of the absolute.
The decline and fall of the absolute. And so, that's what is immediately brought up when people talk about British idealism, is like the absolute, and what is the absolute? And there's actually a hilarious, philosophical parody is not a very populated genre, but I quite enjoy it. So there was a British, he was kind of a pragmatist. He labeled himself, I guess, as a pragmatist, named JFC Fuller. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. A friend of mine calls him Jesus fucking Christ Fuller. JFC Fuller. And he lived at a time of like late 19th century, in Oxford, where you had a lot of British idealist philosophers, and they are talking about the absolute, reality and appearance, these kind of very, very heady, like metaphysical concepts. Anyway, he entirely himself, this guy, JFC Fuller, wrote a parody issue of Mind, the philosophical journal, like 140 pages, where he like wrote all these fake articles with like ridiculous names of like, written, it was like Mind, a unique review written by a troglodyte, and all these like Victorian jokes and like little like poems, and like he would like parody people's names. And, I mean, the jokes aren't very funny, but it's amazing. This guy spent like 180 pages of writing, like real work, to just create like lampooning, the British idealist tradition.
Okay.
And I think all of this speaks to kind of strange, if the kind of strangeness of British idealism to some respect, in that it felt like German thinking had kind of rooted into the soil of good old England, which was, I think, for many people, it felt strange and wrong. And we can get into why that led to it being kind of pushed out. But it really begins to some degree with Thomas Carlyle, and even before him, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the poet. Mm. He read Schelling, and he was among like the first like translations of Schelling. I think a lot of people think that he has a very idiosyncratic take on like Kant and German idealists, but Coleridge actually wrote a logic called The Science of Method, and some very interesting stuff, because he's more broadly known as a poet. But it was no secret that like there was something special happening in Germany with Kant and the German idealist movement afterwards. And so this, of course, had a tremendous impact on France, on Italy, but very much in England. But it was interesting that it took quite a long time. So even though Carlyle is writing in like the 1820s, the 1830s, it doesn't really become like institutional. And one very big blind spot in kind of the history of philosophy is like, what is going on in English philosophy between David Hume and John Stuart Mill? Like, I don't really, I can't, you know, before I started looking into it, I wouldn't even be able to name anybody in that period. Yeah. And it was really like a lot of Scottish guys, actually. Like probably the most preeminent was this guy, Sir William Hamilton.
Yeah.
And anyway, all of it to say is that there was this very like eclectic quality to British philosophy in the early 19th century, where they were trying to incorporate aspects of like, you know, the cutting edge of philosophy, which they felt like was going on in Germany, but also, you know, continuing their native traditions of like common sense Scottish philosophy, empiricism, you know, exemplified by David Hume. And so this eclectic atmosphere led to like some interesting discussions. Like, for example, John Stuart Mill had kind of controversies with this Scottish philosopher, William Hamilton. I think John Stuart Mill was Scottish himself, actually. He's the godfather of Bertrand Russell, by the way, John Stuart Mill. And so they had controversies, and it is fascinating because sort of the initial like British idealist, the first guy who's genuinely in the tradition, is this man named Thomas Hill Green. And if you look at his sort of autobiography, his philosophical autobiography, he says that he saw these controversies of like John Stuart Mill arguing with Sir William Hamilton and these things, and he felt it was so stale. It felt so old hat. It felt so stagnant. Mm-hmm. And he really saw that the German tradition, it felt more vital. It felt, you know, perhaps even a politically revolutionary quality to it. Mm-hmm. And, you know, that might seem like a very non-philosophical reason why he like started, you know, getting more interested in them, but that seems to be wise. This feeling of like, it's more exciting, you know, German philosophy is more exciting over there. And so he became a kind of a staple of British academia, Thomas Hill Green. And I've actually heard Robert Brandom, it's like a kind of famous analytic philosopher now. He said that he values Thomas Hill Green's introductions. So T.H. Green is how he's referred to. He wrote introductions to both Hume and Locke, like long, like I think over 100 pages each, like introductions to the work. I forget which books exactly of Hume and Locke, but basically, you know, the quintessential empiricists. And they were like very, very critical, using, I think, things that he learned from Kant and Hegel, ways to criticize empiricism. Anyway, Robert Brandom says that he sees these introductions of T.H. Green on the same level as like the opening of Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, of the criticisms of like sense certainty, perception, and that kind of thing. So at least by him, they're esteemed quite highly. So we might think that the British idealism is just like it's they're just mimicking German philosophy or something, but they do have their own, you know, original stuff in many ways. So anyway, T.H. Green is kind of a staple, and he's the teacher of many of the following generation. So you have like Bernard Bosanquet, you have Harold Joachim, you have McTaggart, you know, there are many. I won't go into all of them, but my favorite is F.H. Bradley, a very, very mysterious guy. He, in Oxford at that time, they had something called a lifetime fellowship. And what this means is that if you are elected to the fellowship, and I think that means like passing certain tests, getting certain recommendations, whatever. If you're elected to this fellowship, you have a position for life. So a salary and whatever duties come with this fellowship. And the amazing thing about this fellowship they ended this, by the way, because it was kind of, I think it was something like a monk's life. Like, you are going to be paid for life to be an academic. And they ended this, I think, in the 1870s. So already then it felt like this is a very kind of antiquated tradition.
Yeah.
But F.H. Bradley had this very special fellowship where it was a lifetime guaranteed position with no duties, no teaching duties, no research duties. Basically, you could do whatever you want. But the conditions were you couldn't get married, and I think you had to live in Oxford.
You couldn't get married.
Yeah,
Wow.
so you can see the kind of religious, monk-like aspect of it.
So it's like they wanted to make their own quasi-monk thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, you live for the ideas now, man.
Exactly, and it's like I read the specific like legal language of the fellowship, and it's like this fellowship is void upon marriage or death. And it's like wow. And so he never got married his whole life. F.H. Bradley. He did have a woman who he met in Paris when he would travel there. But anyway, yeah, he was basically like a monk type figure, and he became famous because the only way he's kind of an anti-Socrates. The only way he communicated was through his books, really, and writing. He wasn't really like super extroverted, conversation, and he had no teaching duties, so he didn't teach at all. So the only way he was known is really through his writing. And he lived his whole life. You can find like little memoirs of subsequent academics, talking about Bradley, like kind of like working in the gardens at Oxford, because he lived there his whole life on condition of the fellowship, still taking meals in the common room and everything. Quite a different, academic world than I say we live in. Anyway,
yeah.
But Bradley is very, very brilliant, but very strange. Just his biggest book appearance in Reality, as we kind of mentioned, it spawned many like responses. Whitehead's Process in Reality, Bosanquet, although he's referring to the phrase, not the book. Knowledge in Reality. Many people like kind of wrote responses to it. And it has to do with this idea of the absolute, and how do you reconcile something like the absolute with the everyday experience that we have. And so
yeah, so speaking about the absolute is something that Schelling and Hegel talk about, but Fichte as well, right? And yeah, it's like this monolithic, monumental thing that, well, how the hell can you even begin to approach it, right? But I find Hegel already sort of dethrones and deconstructs the absolute in his logic, right? He's got a chapter titled The Absolute, and he runs through it, right? What it entails and what it involves. So the absolute turns out to be not so absolute after all, and Hegel sort of did that critique. But it seems to linger on, like this from what I hear about the British idealists. And maybe it has different connotations in the term, right? So you were speaking about how the absolute relates to the everyday, right? Well, if you think with Collingwood, well, of course they have to overlap in some sense. And that the absolute is not about erasing the everyday or pretending it out of existence, even though that seems to be certainly what a lot of philosophy has been doing, pretending things out of existence and pretending other things into existence, right? So do you know how can you say a bit about how they grappled with that, how they viewed the absolute in terms of the everyday and what they proposed to deal with it and so on?
Yeah. I mean, they get into the weeds. I think that's why, like, Collingwood saw fit to write an essay on Bradley as well, because I think everybody kind of disagreed with Bradley, but they saw why it was plausible he could go in the direction he did, and he does veer kind of the direction that the everyday is kind of something like an illusion. His big book is called Appearance and Reality, and something like appearance is just that, appearance, and there's reality behind it. And reality is ultimately something like the absolute. And you might think of the absolute as the absolute is what gives things their reality. Right. So we might think if you're a materialist, you might think that being located in the chain of cause and effect of material bodies, that is what reality is. That's what gives something its real quality, if it's in the chain of cause and effect. Right. Now for somebody like Bradley, somebody who's thinking about the absolute, being located within the absolute, that is the mark of reality. And of course we'd have to spell out exactly what that means, but he's nuanced, because he doesn't want to just say, okay, here's illusion, because then you have a question, well, what is illusion then? What is the status of mere appearance? Is it just like a reveal? And so he goes into that. He has a sort of talks about immediacy and immediate, and the status of what we arrive at logically versus the senses. We could say a lot more, but maybe this will be a kind of an easy, short way. He ultimately says he's not a Hegelian. He feels like more like a Kantian. He says that like kind of at a later point in his life. Okay. So that might give some indication of how he's trying to think the absolute.
Yeah. Collingwood himself also has very definite Kantian streaks, if not ultimately Kantian. But like the way, just because I'm a science and logic kind of guy, and that's my, I'm a big fan of that. So the way Hegel approaches the distinction of appearance and reality is like, well, what appears has to be the most real, because if it's a reality that doesn't appear, then it's something less of a reality. So the most essential reality is the one that does appear. Right. So he sort of flips it around, twists it a little bit, right? And I think maybe this is what Kant wanted to say, but he couldn't, because of his transcendental system and the way that worked. And so once you have that mindset, then reality isn't something that has to be posited beyond appearances, but is something that takes place within appearances, right? And so there's still going to be a distinction between what appears and what doesn't appear. There's a whole lot of stuff that doesn't appear, but it cannot completely not appear, because that just by definition has no reality. The way Hegel puts it in that chapter is like essence must appear, and it does need to have some anchoring in what appears, but there's a lot of stuff that doesn't have a nature of appearance, right? Thoughts, laws, we just don't dig up into the ground and find, there's the law of this, this law of nature, or there we have, the category of, becoming, just like sitting there, right?
Yes.
But at the same time, there isn't a wholly intelligible world that is completely divorced and detached from all those things, because how would you then you end up with a kind of dualism, and then you have some really deep problems. So for Hegel, he's very Collingwoodian in the sense of like, it's reality has always been within appearances to begin with, otherwise it wouldn't be reality. So the two are sort of intertwined from the base, from the get-go. They're at unity.
Yeah, ultimately, I haven't mastered Appearance and Reality by Bradley, but my feeling is ultimately like he does kind of fall prey to these aporia. Yeah. But he really digs into the issues. So I find, people say he's like one of the worst writers in English. I find him one of the best, just because he really sacrifices nothing in trying to spell out like sort of the philosophical quandaries. And it does give his kind of writing a kind of swamp-like quality, but I think for me it's reflective of the subject matter. It's like he really gets into it. And that sort of I read the British idealists more, not because I think that like they could surpass German idealism, but more because I want to talk about German idealism, but I'm an English speaker, and I found like they found some of the best ways to kind of speak about these ideas, because just directly translating is not always capturing the essence of it. Sometimes translation is a very creative process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so that's the kind of potential I see in the British idealists. But if I can just say a quick thing about how they ended, really, it was the First World War that kind of really ended it. Again, a non-philosophical thing.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating because it was like a two-pronged attack. There was the First World War, and then there was the analytic kind of movement. And it's so interesting because Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore make the exact same complaints about the idealist tradition that T.H. Green did about the empiricist tradition. They're like, this is all so stale. They're talking about the absolute. They're talking about, metaphysics. This all seems so quaint and old hat. And we need something new, something that feels like revolutionary, something up to date. And so it's amazing that like each generation is like, oh, the old generation stuff is boring. And there was actually a politician. He did one of the first translations of Schopenhauer. He was, really quite a broad reader of German idealism. His name is R.B. Haldane. He was actually fairly accomplished in British politics, and he was forced to resign during the First World War. And historians are unanimously agreed that the only reason he was forced to resign is because he liked German philosophy and literature so much. And that was not acceptable when we're at war with the Germans.
Yeah.
And you can see immediately, like, everybody looking at like, why are the most prestigious philosophers at Oxford all reading like German stuff? Why are they like using all this German terminology? Why are they talking about like Kant, Hegel? Like,
yeah,
they're kind of our enemy, the Hun.
Right.
So I don't find that British idealism had a very satisfactory ending. It just kind of was pushed out for political and cultural reasons. So
right. Yeah.
But that means I feel like it's still kind of a live option of study.
Yeah. And who knows, maybe what's going on in the British academia today suddenly becomes stale and old hat, right?
I think we're seeing that, yeah.
It's strange how this rotation thing seems to occur, where the same complaints lodged at the previous generation just comes up. And so it's not really a complaint about the topic or the content, right? It's not really addressing the details. It's just like, oh, this has been around for a while. Let's do something else. That's basically what it's saying.
Exactly.
And is that framework, something that we as philosophers want to aspire to? We're interested in the truth, and of course the truth develops. It's continual becoming, so it naturally should integrate new things and new details and new discoveries and new appearances and what have you. So I think maybe we should start from a better standpoint ultimately.
I wholeheartedly agree.
All right, Lew, I need to get going. It's been really nice to chat with you as always, and feel like now that we should all just start a course, if not a reading group at least, on the British Idealists, and just dig into Bradley and the others and figure out what it was all about. Because I think you're right to point out that German idealism is within a certain time, within a language, within a tradition, but you and me are not in that time now. We are in a different time. We have different concerns and so on. So we kind of automatically have to creatively translate the contents to sort of make it work for us, right? And I think the same thing faced the British idealists when they started out. Like, yeah, they have their own concerns, their own tradition, and as you pointed out, they can be a good way to get us further along that process of creative translation.
Exactly. Yeah, couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks so much for this conversation, Philip.
All right. Well, it's been good seeing you. And to everybody who's tuned in, and just if you're interested in wanting to hear more, just post comments and stuff, and hopefully Lew and I will get to them and we'll be able to answer your questions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.